Hello everyone. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time it is. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories like this. Now, let the shadows take over. I moved into that little rental house in Dayton, Ohio during the summer of 2018, and I can still remember how excited I was that first week. For years, I'd been stuck in noisy apartments with super thin walls, roommates who partied all night, and neighbors who argued so loudly that you couldn't help but hear every detail. I was burned out, tired, and really wanted some peace. When I saw the listing for a small one-story house on the edge of town, it felt like a dream come true. The rent was cheap, the place had a porch, a fenced-in backyard, and best of all, it was just mine. No roommates, no landlords bothering me, no shared walls, just me. The house wasn't perfect. The paint was chipped, the hardwood floors creaked with every step, and the cabinets looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1980s. But when I walked in with the keys for the first time, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood, and for the first time in a long time I felt a kind of calm I hadn't known I needed. It wasn't fancy, but it was freedom. The neighborhood seemed just as peaceful. The houses were old, but taken care of with neat lawns and flower beds. Kids rode bikes up and down the block during the day, and in the evenings older couples sat on porches waving at whoever walked by. At night, the sounds were so different from what I was used to. No loud music through thin apartment walls, no arguments outside the door, no traffic jammed up against the building. Instead, I'd sit on my porch with a cold drink and listen to cicadas buzzing in the trees, the distant hum of cars on the highway a couple miles away, maybe the occasional bark of a dog down the street. For the first week I thought, this is it. This is how life is supposed to be. And then I met my neighbor. The first time I saw him was late one night. I had just finished carrying in a box of books from my car when I noticed movement next door. At first I thought it was a tree moving in the breeze, but then I saw him. He was tall, thin, maybe late 40s, standing in his yard just inside the shadows. He wasn't doing anything. Not smoking, not letting a dog out, not picking something up. He was just standing there facing my house. It was July, hot and sticky, and yet he was wearing a gray hoodie pulled up over his head. I couldn't even see his hair. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there. I figured I should try to be friendly, so I gave him a little wave. He didn't wave back. He just smiled. And it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too stiff, like someone who had practiced what a smile was supposed to look like, but didn't quite get it right. Something about it bothered me, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was shy. Maybe he was just a little odd. But over the next week I realized it wasn't a one-time thing. He was always outside. When I left for work in the morning, he was sitting on his porch. When I came home in the evening, he'd be pacing his driveway, hands shoved deep in that hoodie pocket. Sometimes late at night I'd peek through the blinds and see him leaning against his fence, not moving, staring straight at my house. At first I told myself he was harmless. Maybe he had trouble sleeping. Maybe he was just a lonely guy. I even tried to break the ice one morning. I was heading to work, and he was standing by his mailbox. I said morning and gave him a nod. He looked at me for a long moment like he was trying to decide if he should answer. Then he turned and walked back toward his porch without saying a word. That was the first time I felt a real knot of worry in my stomach. The knocking started a few nights later. It was just after 2:00 in the morning when I woke up to a sound at the front door. 3 slow, careful knocks. Not hurried, not friendly, just patient. I froze in bed, holding my breath, waiting to see if it would happen again. It didn't. After a minute or two, I convinced myself it was some drunk kid messing around. I forced myself back to sleep. The next night, the same thing. 3 slow knocks at the front door again around 2 in the morning. This time I crept to the window in the living room and peeked through the blinds. My blood ran cold. Greg, the neighbor, was standing halfway between his house and mine, staring directly at my door. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there like he'd been waiting for me to open it. By the 3rd night I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police. An officer came out, walked over to Greg's yard and talked to him for a few minutes. Then he came back and told me Greg seemed harmless. He said Greg told him he was just checking on me. That phrase stuck in my head like a splinter. Checking on me. The officer shrugged, told me to keep my doors locked and left. That's when things got worse. A few nights later, I was brushing my teeth when I heard a scraping sound at my bedroom window. The window was on the second floor. My stomach dropped. I turned off the light, crept toward the window and peeled back the blinds. Greg's face was there, inches away, grinning through the glass. He was on a ladder at 2:00 in the morning at my second floor window. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my toothbrush, and grabbed my phone. By the time I called 911, he was gone. When the police arrived, they found his ladder leaning against my house, but no sign of him. They knocked on his door, no answer. They told me they'd keep an eye out. After that, I barely slept. I taped my curtains shut, left lights on in every room, carried a baseball bat with me from one room to another. But Greg didn't stop. He just changed tactics. One afternoon, I came home from work and found a Polaroid photo tucked under my doormat. It was of my bedroom window taken from his yard. No, just the photo. The police didn't even come this time. They told me over the phone there was no proof it was him. The next night, I heard footsteps in my backyard. Slow, careful. I stood in the dark, clutching the bat, staring at the back door, waiting for it to open. It didn't. But in the morning, I found muddy footprints by the fence. For weeks, I lived like that, jumping at every creak in the house, every shadow outside. I'd look out the blinds and see him in his yard, standing still. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night to that same 3-knock pattern at the door. Sometimes I'd hear scraping at the windows. I'd call the police and they'd come out, but nothing ever happened while they were there. It was like he knew how to time it. Then came the night that broke me. It was 3 in the morning when I woke to the sound of my back door creaking open. Not knocking, not scraping, opening. I grabbed the bat and crept into the kitchen, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The back door was wide open, the curtain moving in the night air. I stood frozen, certain he was inside, and then I heard them, footsteps in the hallway. Slow, heavy, coming closer. I whispered into the phone as I dialed 911, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold it. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. The police showed up 20 minutes later. They searched every inch of the house. Nothing. But when they checked Greg's property, it was empty, completely cleared out. Furniture gone, windows open. He had disappeared overnight. The landlord said he hadn't given notice. He just disappeared. I moved out a month later, still shaken, telling myself I'd never see him again. But sometimes late at night, I wake to a sound that makes my blood run cold. 3 patient knocks at the door, and I don't dare get up to check because deep down, I don't think Greg ever really left. When I was 22, I moved to Boston for graduate school. And like most broke students, I didn't have a lot of choices when it came to housing. The listings I could afford were either run-down apartments in bad neighborhoods or tiny spaces with rent that still stretched my budget to the limit. When I saw the ad for a cozy basement studio on a quiet street near the university, it seemed almost too good to be true. The price was low, the location was perfect, and the landlord didn't even ask for a credit check. I signed the lease the same day. The apartment itself wasn't fancy. It was half underground with 2 small windows that barely let in light, and the walls were covered in this fake wood paneling that looked like it had been there since the 1970s. The ceiling was low, and you could hear footsteps echoing from the apartment upstairs whenever someone walked across. But it had a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and just enough space for a bed and a desk. For a broke graduate student, it was perfect. Or at least that's what I thought at first. The man who lived upstairs introduced himself on my first day. His name was Mr. Carter, mid-50s, balding on top with these wire-framed glasses that made his eyes look too big. He seemed friendly enough. He offered to help me carry boxes down into the basement and kept telling me how happy he was to finally have a good tenant. He said the last guy had been messy, always leaving trash outside, and he appreciated someone quiet and respectful. At the time, I thought I'd lucked out. Having a nice landlord right above me seemed like a bonus. At first, everything was normal. I went to class, came home late, and spent my night studying in that dim little basement. Sometimes I'd hear Mr. Carter moving around upstairs, and every now and then he'd knock on my door just to check in. He'd ask if the heat was working, if the water pressure was okay, if I needed anything. I thought he was just being polite, but after a few weeks, things started to feel off. It began with small stuff. I'd come home from class and notice my desk chair pulled out when I was sure I'd tucked it in. My toothbrush would be slightly damp, even though I hadn't used it all day. One night I found the fridge door left open, just a crack. and a carton of eggs that I knew had been full was missing too. At first I told myself I was just tired, maybe forgetful. Graduate school was stressful, and I chalked it up to being absent-minded. But then there were things I couldn't explain away. I woke up one morning and found my phone on the kitchen counter instead of on the nightstand where I always left it charging. My bed sheets were pulled tighter than I'd made them, tucked in at the corners in a way I never did. And once when I came home earlier than usual, I swore I heard footsteps in my apartment. Slow, careful, like someone walking across the floor. But by the time I opened the door, the place was empty. The first time I talked to Mr. Carter about it, I tried to keep it casual. I said something like, "Hey, you don't happen to have a spare key to my place, do you?" He smiled too quickly, like he'd been waiting for the question, and said, "Of course he did, but he only used it for emergencies." I nodded, trying to act normal, but inside I felt a chill. From then on, I started locking the chain on the inside at night. It was the only lock he couldn't open, or at least that's what I thought. One night around 2 in the morning, I woke to a faint scraping sound. At first I thought it was upstairs, maybe Mr. Carter moving furniture. But then I realized it was coming from my ceiling, the sound of wood shifting, nails creaking like someone crawling above me. I held my breath, staring at the panels overhead, half expecting them to break open. The noise stopped after a minute, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I dragged a chair into the kitchen and climbed up to look at one of the ceiling vents. When I looked inside with a flashlight, my stomach turned. The metal grate was scratched, edges bent slightly, like it had been pried open, and behind it, deeper in the duct, I thought I saw something shine. I couldn't quite reach it, but it looked like a lens, like the reflection from glass. That's when I bought a camera. Nothing fancy, just a cheap, motion-activated one I set up in the corner of my room, pointing at my bed. I figured if someone was actually coming in at night, I'd catch them. For 3 nights, nothing happened. The camera picked up nothing but me tossing and turning in my sleep. I almost started to feel stupid, like maybe I was imagining everything. But on the 4th night, I woke up to a faint click from the camera. In the morning, I checked the footage. At 3:19 a.m., the door to my apartment opened. Slowly, quietly, a figure slipped inside. The camera caught him only in partial light, but I knew immediately who it was. Mr. Carter. He stood there for a long moment, staring at me while I slept, then walked over to my desk. He picked up my phone, scrolled through it for a minute, then set it back down. He opened my fridge, took out a soda, drank half of it, and put it back. Then he walked over to my bed. For almost 10 minutes, he just stood there watching me, breathing. His hand hovered inches from my face like he wanted to touch me, but was holding back. Then he leaned down so close I could see his glasses shining in the night vision lens and whispered something. The camera didn't catch the words, just the faint movement of his lips. Then he walked out as quietly as he'd come in. I sat there staring at the footage, shaking so badly I almost dropped the camera. He'd been coming into my apartment, standing over me while I slept, and God only knew how many times it had happened before. I went straight to the police. They took the report, but when I showed them the footage, the officer said it wasn't clear enough to prove anything. Could be anyone, he said. Might not hold up in court. I felt sick. That night I didn't sleep at all. I kept every light on, the chain lock fastened, the bat I kept by my bed clutched in my hand. And still, around 2 in the morning, I heard it again, the scraping in the ceiling. I dragged the chair over, yanked open the vent, and shined my flashlight inside. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just scratches. There was space back there, a crawl space above the basement ceiling. And inside, pushed back just out of reach, was a blanket, a water bottle, and a small pile of wrappers. Someone had been living there. Before I could process it, I heard movement, a shift of weight, the sound of breathing. My light caught eyes reflecting in the dark, staring back at me. I fell off the chair, scrambled toward the door, but before I could open it, something slammed against the ceiling panels from above. Once, twice, dust rained down. I ran into the hallway and didn't stop until I was pounding on a neighbor's door 2 houses down. By the time the police came back with me, the crawl space was empty. The blanket, the wrappers, the water bottle, gone. They searched Mr. Carter's apartment upstairs, but it was spotless. Too spotless. He denied everything. Said I was making it up. Without evidence, they couldn't do a thing. I moved out the next day, left half my stuff behind because I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that basement again. It's been years since then, but even now, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I can hear someone breathing just out of sight. And I'll never forget the way those eyes looked, staring back at me from the crawl space, watching, waiting. When I was 26, I rented a house in Chandler, Arizona. I'd been working a stressful job in Phoenix and wanted a quieter neighborhood where I could actually get some rest. The place I found wasn't fancy. It was a modest single-story home with faded stucco walls, a gravel front yard instead of grass, and a sagging wooden fence out back. But it had one thing I wanted more than anything: peace, no constant traffic noise, no drunk neighbors pounding on walls at 3 in the morning, just silence, or at least that's what I thought I was getting. The street itself was nothing special. A row of houses built in the early 2000s, all beige and cream with desert landscaping and the occasional palm tree. Families lived here, retired couples, the kind of block where people jog in the mornings and wave when they pass you. Safe, normal. The house directly across the street caught my attention early on. It looked almost the same as the others, but the blinds in the upstairs window were always shut tight. The lawn was neatly kept, the driveway spotless, and every night, without fail, I'd see the glow of a single lamp in that upstairs room. The man who lived there introduced himself during my first week. His name was David. Mid-40s, thinning hair, polite but with a distracted kind of energy. He mentioned he lived alone with his daughter, a teenager named Lily. I saw her once or twice in passing. Dark hair, pale skin, quiet. She never waved, never smiled, just walked quickly from the car to the front door with her head down. I figured she was shy. Teenagers can be like that. At first, nothing seemed strange. David worked long hours from what I could tell. Most nights, the house looked dark except for that one lamp in the upstairs window. Sometimes, if I was outside late, I'd glance over and see Lily sitting at her desk, head bent over what looked like homework. Normal stuff. Then came the night I couldn't sleep. It was a Friday in late October. The desert air finally cooling down enough to leave my window cracked open. I was tossing and turning, scrolling through my phone when I happened to glance outside. That's when I saw her. Lily standing in the upstairs window. She wasn't at her desk. She wasn't moving. She was standing perfectly still, facing my house, her face half lit by the glow of the lamp. At first I thought maybe she was looking at the street, zoning out. But after a full minute I realized she hadn't moved an inch, not even a blink. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, uneasy. Teenagers do weird stuff, I told myself. Maybe she couldn't sleep either. I forced myself to look away and eventually drifted off. The next night it happened again. I stayed up late watching a movie, and when I went to the kitchen for water around 2:45 a.m., I glanced outside. Lily was there. Same window, same position, perfectly still, staring at my house. I froze in the kitchen, glass of water halfway to my lips. She didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't blink. I stood there watching for maybe 3 minutes, my skin crawling. Finally, I yanked the blind shut and told myself not to look again. But of course I did. Over the next week, I started noticing a pattern. Every night, exactly at 2:45 a.m., she was there, always the same, standing in the upstairs window, not moving, eyes locked on my house. I told myself she must be sleepwalking. Maybe she had some kind of condition. Still, it bothered me enough that I mentioned it to David one Saturday afternoon. He was out front washing his car, and I tried to sound casual when I said, "Hey, I've noticed your daughter's up late a lot. She okay?" The sponge in his hand slipped, splashing water onto his jeans. For a split second his face twisted. Panic, fear of something raw before he forced a smile. "She's fine," he said quickly. "Just don't pay attention to that." His tone was sharp, almost begging. Then he added, "And if I were you, I wouldn't look at that window again." I laughed awkwardly, waiting for him to explain, but he turned his back and started scrubbing the car harder, like the conversation was over. That night I tried to follow his advice. I kept my blinds shut, avoided the window, buried myself in work, but curiosity gnawed at me. Around 2:40 a.m. I couldn't resist. I crept to the window, lifted the corner of the blinds just enough to peek. She was there, Lily, perfectly still, perfectly silent. But this time she wasn't alone. My stomach dropped. Standing beside her was another figure identical. Same hair, same pale face, same clothes. Two lilies, both staring directly at my house. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering. I sat in the dark of my living room, every nerve screaming until the first hint of sunrise finally pushed through the blinds. The next day, I told myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew what I saw. I tried talking to David again, but he shut me down before I could finish. His voice was low, urgent. You don't understand. You need to stop watching for your own sake. That night, I locked every door, every window, and still lay awake until nearly 3. Against my better judgment, I looked. Only one lily this time, but she wasn't standing at the window anymore. She was closer, pressed up against the glass, her face inches from it across the street. And even from that distance, in the dim glow of the lamp, I could see her lips moving, whispering something. I couldn't hear the words, but my skin crawled all the same. The following evening, I came home from work to find a note slipped under my door. No envelope, no signature, just a scrap of lined paper with 4 words scrawled in jagged handwriting. Don't watch the window. That night, I shut my blinds tight and tried to obey. But just knowing she was there, waiting was unbearable. Around 3 a.m., I cracked the blinds just a fraction. This time the window was dark. No lamp, no lily. For the first time in weeks, the room across the street was empty. Relief washed over me until I heard the sound, a faint tapping from my own window. I turned slowly, heart pounding, and there she was, Lily. Her pale face pressed against the glass from the outside, eyes locked on mine. But I live on a single story. There's no balcony, no ledge, just sheer wall beneath that window. I screamed, stumbled backward, and when I looked again, the glass was empty. The next morning, I marched across the street and pounded on David's door. He opened it a crack, looking haggard, dark circles under his eyes. I told you not to look, he whispered, and shut the door in my face. 2 days later, police cars lined the street. I watched from my porch as officers went in and out of David's house. A detective finally came over to ask if I'd seen anything unusual. I told him about the lights, about the girl in the window. He exchanged a glance with his partner, then said, "Sir, David's daughter died in a car accident 8 months ago." I stammered, tried to argue, but he shook his head. "There's no one else in that house." That night at 2:45 a.m., I couldn't resist. I looked one last time. The lamp was on, and in the upstairs window, Lily stood perfectly still, staring straight at me. Music. When I was 28, I rented a townhouse on the east side of Denver. It wasn't anything fancy, just one of those older buildings with rows of connected units, each with the same brick outside and narrow little porches. It was close enough to downtown that my drive to work wasn't a nightmare, but far enough out that the neighborhood stayed quiet. That's what I wanted most, quiet. The townhouse I picked had 2 bedrooms, just enough space for me and my dog Riley. The walls were a little scuffed. The carpet had seen better days, but the rent was doable, and the neighbors all seemed normal. Families, a few retirees, people walking dogs in the evening. For the first time in a while, I thought I might finally be able to settle into a routine. My next-door neighbor was a woman named Mrs. Holloway. She was probably late 60s, maybe early 70s, with neatly curled white hair and big glasses that always slid down her nose. The first time I met her, she was trimming roses out front. She smiled politely, told me she'd lived in the complex for almost 30 years, and welcomed me to the neighborhood. Nothing unusual. She seemed like the type who probably baked cookies for church events or played cards with other retirees. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. I'd wave to Mrs. Holloway when I saw her. She'd wave back, and that was the extent of our relationship. She kept to herself, and so did I. But it didn't take long before I noticed something strange. It started at night. My bedroom wall shared a side with her townhouse, and around midnight I began hearing sounds. At first I thought it was just the pipes or maybe her TV on low volume. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't either of those. It was voices, muffled but clear. Sometimes it sounded like crying, other times like whispers, and it wasn't just one voice. It was several overlapping, low, desperate, almost like prayers. The first time I sat up in bed, straining to hear, I finally convinced myself it had to be a late-night movie she was watching. The walls were thin, That had to be it. But when it happened again the next night and the night after that, I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't a movie. The voices rose and fell in rhythm, punctuated by soft sobs, then silence, then starting again, always after midnight. I thought about knocking on the wall, but something in me hesitated. The sounds didn't feel like something I was supposed to interrupt, so I tried to forget about it. Then I started noticing other things. Packages on her porch. Big, heavy boxes delivered at odd hours. I'd get home from work at 6 p.m. and there'd be nothing there. Then at midnight, I'd take Riley outside and see a cardboard box sitting neatly by her door. I never once saw a delivery truck. And the labels, when I passed by on my way to the trash cans, were always the same kinds of things. Padlocks, chains, heavy-duty bolts, soundproofing foam, even industrial cleaner. It was weird, sure, but I told myself maybe she was just overly cautious. Maybe she had a handyman helping her with repairs. Except I never heard the sound of power tools or construction. Just those voices at night. One evening I ran into her by the mailboxes and tried to bring it up casually. "Hey, everything okay with your place? I've noticed you're getting a lot of stuff delivered." Her smile froze. For a moment, she just looked at me over the top of her glasses, her eyes hard and unblinking. Then she said, "Some things are best not noticed," and turned away before I could respond. That night, the voices through the wall were louder than ever. I couldn't take it anymore. Around 1 a.m., I pressed my ear against the drywall, my heart hammering. The sound was unmistakable, sobbing. Multiple people. The words were too muffled to make out. But I could feel the vibration of fists hitting the wall. Someone or several someones were pounding, begging. I pulled back, my skin crawling. Riley was whining at the door, ears back like she sensed it too. I almost called the cops then and there, but something stopped me. Fear, maybe, or the thought that I wouldn't be believed. What if it really was just her TV and I sounded crazy? The next morning, I decided to check for myself. I waited until Mrs. Holloway left. She drove an old blue car and usually went out around 10 so. Once she pulled away, I walked around the back of the townhouse complex. Each unit had a small fenced patio, and from the alley you could see the back windows. Her upstairs curtains were drawn tight, but downstairs I caught a glimpse through a narrow gap. Just for a second before the curtain shifted, but it was enough. Chains, thick chains bolted to the floor. I hurried back home, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But later that week, it happened again. The crying, the pounding louder than ever. This time I called the police. 2 officers showed up, knocked on her door, spoke with her for a few minutes, then left. One of them came over to reassure me. She's an old woman living alone. No sign of anyone else inside, probably just the TV. He said it with that tone that told me not to waste their time again. But I knew what I'd heard. 2 nights later I got proof. The crying turned into screaming, high-pitched, raw, terrified. I didn't hesitate this time. I called 911 again, demanding they send someone. Within minutes, police cars pulled up. I watched from my porch as officers pounded on her door. At first she didn't answer. Then finally, they forced their way inside. I'll never forget the look on one officer's face when he came back out, pale, shaken. He told me they'd found a locked room at the back of the house, padlocked from the outside. When they cut it open, it was empty. No people, no bodies, just 4 walls covered in deep scratches, chains bolted to the floor, and dozens of Polaroid photos taped to the wall. Photos of me sleeping in my bed, me sitting at my desk, me cooking in my kitchen. I couldn't breathe when he told me. The cops took the photos, but they didn't arrest her. They said there was no sign of a crime, no victims, nothing they could charge her with. Mrs. Holloway was gone by the next morning, vanished. The car, her belongings, everything, gone. For a while, things were quiet. I started to convince myself it was over, that maybe she'd moved away and taken whatever madness with her. But then a few weeks later, the sounds returned. Not from her townhouse, from mine. Late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it. Muffled crying, faint pounding coming from inside my own walls. And that's when I realized she hadn't left at all. The first time I noticed anything strange about the man in apartment 12. It wasn't the way he looked or how he avoided conversation. It was the object he carried. I was coming up the stairwell with a bag of groceries, sweating under the weight of a 12-pack of soda and a week's worth of canned soup, when I saw him dragging something across the landing. It was tall, wrapped tightly in a yellowing sheet and tied with old string. And for a split second, my brain thought it was a coffin. The thing scraped against the wall with a shrill sound that made my teeth hurt, and he struggled to wedge it through the door of his apartment. Out of instinct, I offered to help, asking if he needed another pair of hands. He froze at the sound of my voice. His head turned slowly, weirdly slow, like his neck had to remember how to turn. His eyes were dark, too dark for the dim hallway light to catch. And after a long moment, he said in a flat tone, "He doesn't like to be touched." Then, without another word, he hauled the thing into the apartment and shut the door firmly behind him. That was my introduction to the man in 12. At first, I thought nothing of it. Every building has its quirks, and every tenant has their baggage. I had only just moved into this place 2 weeks earlier, and after years of cramped apartments with thin walls and rowdy neighbors, I was just grateful for the quiet. The building wasn't much, an aging 3-story walk-up with a cracked parking lot, peeling paint, and flickering lights in the hallway. But it was affordable and close enough to work that I didn't mind. My own unit was small but comfortable, and most importantly, it was mine. For the first week or so, apartment 12 was just another door across the landing. I'd hear faint footsteps sometimes, a shuffle of movement in the late hours, or the low hum of a lamp when I passed his window. Nothing strange, nothing alarming. The man himself was tall and thin, always carrying the same set of keys in one hand, always wearing the same wrinkled brown shirt, always avoiding eye contact. He'd nod if we crossed paths, but never smiled, never spoke. I chalked it up to being odd. Some people just want to be left alone. But then, little by little, I began to notice things. It started with sound. My bedroom wall shared a side with his living room, and at night, when the building was quiet and the city noise had dulled to nothing, I'd hear it. A low murmur, rhythmic, pulsing in a way that made it feel on purpose. At first, I thought he was talking on the phone, maybe speaking a language I didn't recognize. But the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't conversation. It was chanting, words strung together in a low monotone, too steady to be casual. Sometimes it was only one voice. Other times it sounded like several overlapping, weaving together in a murky chorus that raised the hairs on my arms. I tried to tell myself it was the pipes or maybe a late-night podcast turned up too loud. But the more I listened, the harder it was to lie to myself. The whispers weren't random. They were on purpose. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying hard to make out the words. The sound stopped instantly, cutting off in the middle of a syllable. The silence that followed was so sharp it hurt, and I stumbled back from the wall with my heart pounding. The next morning, his door was cracked open as I left for work. Just a sliver, but enough to see inside. I froze in the hallway, my grocery bag dangling forgotten at my side. His apartment wasn't furnished with a couch or a TV or even a dining table. It was filled with mirrors, dozens of them, tall ones, short ones, square, round, cracked, spotless. Some leaned against walls. Others sat propped on chairs or stacked against one another in wobbly towers. In the center of the room stood the largest mirror of them all, the one I had seen him drag inside. It was no longer wrapped in its sheet. It stood bare, its fancy gold frame catching the dim hallway light. The glass was cracked along one corner, but otherwise clean. And though the angle was wrong, though it was impossible from where I stood, I could swear I saw myself in it. The door creaked shut before I could process it. That night, the whispers came again. Louder this time. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body tense, listening to the low murmur through the wall. It built and built until it felt like the voices were inside my own room, crawling along the edges of my skull. Then suddenly they stopped and I heard my name, whispered, drawn out. I bolted upright, my mouth dry, my body trembling. The next day I asked the neighbor upstairs, a woman in her 50s who'd lived there for years, if she knew anything about the man in 12. The moment I said his number, her face got hard. She shook her head and muttered, "People don't last long in that unit. They all bring mirrors, always mirrors, and then they disappear. Sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes without moving a single thing out. Just gone." Her words clung to me like smoke. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself I was imagining things. But that night the chanting came again, louder than ever. I grabbed my phone, pressed it against the wall and hit record. Minutes later I played it back. At first only static, then faint words bled through. Harsh syllables, rough and raw, not any language I recognized. Layered beneath them was laughter, not booming or joyful, just a thin, breathy chuckle that made my stomach twist. I couldn't bring myself to confront him, but I couldn't leave it alone either. 2 nights later, I woke to a sound that didn't belong. Knocking, 3 steady raps, not at my door, at my bathroom mirror. I sat frozen in bed, listening as the glass rattled softly as though something was pressing against it from the other side. I forced myself out of bed, ripped the mirror off the wall and shoved it face down in the hallway. My pulse didn't slow for hours. The next morning, when I opened my front door to leave for work, a shard of glass lay on my doormat. Old dulled edges yellowed with age. My name was scratched into the surface in jagged lines. I threw it into the dumpster out back and told myself to forget it. But that night, as I looked through my blinds, I saw him in the courtyard, the man from 12. He stood in the shadows, holding the tall mirror upright in front of him. And though I was 3 stories up, though there was no way he could see me clearly in the dark, I watched as his reflection lifted its head and locked eyes with mine. 2 days later, apartment 12 was empty. No mirrors, no furniture, no sign anyone had ever lived there. The landlord claimed the tenant had moved out overnight. No notice, no forwarding address, just gone. For a week, things were quiet. No whispers, no laughter, no knocks. Then one night, brushing my teeth, I leaned over the sink and caught sight of something in the bathroom mirror. Not behind me, inside the glass, a face. My own face, but smiling wide and wrong. Teeth showing in a grin I wasn't making. The glass rattled once, twice, then came the breathy chuckle I had heard on my recording, and I knew without a doubt that whatever he had dragged into Unit 12 hadn't stayed there. I grew up around dogs. My family had 2 golden retrievers when I was a kid, and later my college roommate had a pit mix that thought it was a lap dog. I'd never been afraid of them, not once in my life. If anything, I always found them comforting, loyal, predictable, calming. That's why what happened in Ohio still gets under my skin. I can't look at a dog sitting still in the dark anymore without feeling my chest tighten. I moved into a small cul-de-sac in a suburb just outside Columbus in 2018. It wasn't much, just a 2-bedroom rental with a thin patch of grass out front and siding that was peeling at the edges, but it was quiet and close to the shop where I worked. The street had maybe 8 houses total, each nearly identical, with neatly trimmed hedges and mailboxes leaning just slightly from years of wear. It felt safe, normal. The house directly next to mine belonged to a man named Mr. Hale. He was in his late 40s, wiry build, skin weathered from outdoor work. He wasn't unfriendly exactly, but he had this permanent tightness in his jaw like he was chewing on something bitter. He only ever spoke in short, clipped sentences. I introduced myself when I moved in, shook his hand, and he gave me a stiff nod before going back into his house. The thing I noticed about him right away wasn't the man himself, though. It was his dog. The animal was huge. Black fur so dark it looked almost oily under the sun, with a barrel chest and long legs that gave it a weird shape. At first glance, I thought it was some kind of mastiff mix, maybe with wolfhound in it. Its head was too wide, its body too still. I'd seen big dogs before, but this one carried itself different. The first time I saw it was the night after I moved in. I just finished stacking boxes in my living room when I stepped outside to smoke. That's when I noticed the dog sitting in Hale's yard facing directly toward my house. Not sniffing, not scratching, not even blinking, just sitting upright, eyes locked on my window. At first, I laughed it off. Dog stare. Maybe it was curious about the new neighbor. But after 10 minutes, it hadn't moved a single muscle. Its chest didn't even seem to move with its breathing. It looked like a statue carved out of shadow. I went back inside and shut the blinds. The next night, same thing. 11 p.m. I stepped out to take the trash, and there it was, sitting in the same patch of grass, same posture, same direction, eyes fixed on my house. Over the next week, I started to expect it. No matter the time, midnight, 2 a.m., 3. If I glanced out, I'd see the dog there sitting still, locked on my windows. It never barked, never growled, never wagged its tail. Just watched. I finally worked up the nerve to bring it up to Hale one afternoon while he was out front with a rake. "Your dog's a pretty intense guard dog," I joked, trying to sound casual. He froze, hands tightening on the rake. After a pause, he said quietly, "Don't look at him after midnight. That's when he remembers." Then he turned and walked inside without another word. I stood there, rake still in his lawn, wondering if I'd heard him wrong. That's when he remembers. What the heck was that supposed to mean? That night I didn't sleep much. I kept peeking through the blinds, half expecting the dog to be there, half hoping it wasn't. At 12:03, I couldn't resist anymore. I cracked the blinds open. The dog was closer this time, not in Hale's yard, in mine, sitting perfectly still at the edge of my driveway, eyes fixed on my bedroom window. I dropped the blinds like they'd burned me. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would wake the whole block. The next morning I checked. No paw prints, no disturbed grass, just empty concrete like nothing had been there. Things got worse quickly after that. 2 nights later, I woke from a dream so vivid it left me sweating. In the dream, I was lying in my bed, unable to move, and the dog was there in my room, standing at the foot of the bed. Its chest rose and fell with these slow, heavy breaths, each exhale rattling like a growl. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, 2 pinpricks of light hovering above its muzzle. I jolted awake, heart slamming, and for a moment I swore I could still hear it breathing. The following morning, I found paw prints in my kitchen. Wet prints leading from the back door to the sink. The door was locked, deadbolt still in place, no sign of anyone breaking in. The prints just started in the middle of the tile and ended at the cabinets. I scrubbed them clean, telling myself it had to be a trick of the light. Maybe marks from my own shoes, but deep down I knew better. By the end of the 2nd week, I was barely sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the dog. Sometimes it was in my room. Sometimes it was crouched in the corner of the ceiling like a spider, its long jaws hanging open. Once I dreamed it was sitting in the kitchen chair, its mouth pulling back too far, teeth stretching in rows that didn't belong in any animal. Always watching, always waiting. At 2:59 a.m. one night, I woke to a sound that froze me to the bone. Scratching, not the light kind a dog makes on a door. This was deep, violent gouging. It came from the wall that separated my house from Hale's, the drywall shaking with each stroke. It was so loud it rattled the picture frames. I pressed my ear to the wall in a daze and felt the vibration roll through the plaster like something was tunneling. The sound stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was worse. I didn't hear footsteps outside Hale's place for 3 days after that. No car in the driveway, no lights inside. The blinds stayed closed, but the dog was always there, sitting, watching. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I marched next door one evening and knocked. The door creaked open a crack. The smell that hit me was foul, wrought iron, something wet and sour. My stomach turned. I pushed the door wider and saw the dog up close for the first time. It sat in the middle of the living room, black fur blending with the shadows. Its head turned toward me, eyes catching the dim light. And when it opened its mouth, my knees nearly buckled. The lips pulled back too far. The jaws stretched too wide. Behind the first row of teeth was another and another and another. Rows of them all the way back into darkness. It didn't move toward me. It didn't growl. It just stared, mouth open, endless teeth shining. I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut, and ran into my house. I locked every bolt, every chain, every window. The next morning, Hale's house was empty, completely cleared out. No furniture, no neighbor, no dog, just an abandoned shell. I thought maybe it was over. Maybe they'd left. Maybe whatever that thing was had gone with them. For 2 nights I actually slept. But then I found them again. Paw prints inside my bedroom this time, leading from the wall directly to the foot of my bed. And sometimes when I turn off the lights, I hear claws clicking softly across the floor, circling me in the dark. When I moved into the old brick building on South Ashland Avenue in Chicago, I figured the worst I'd have to deal with was noisy radiators and drafty hallways. The place had been built in the 1920s, and everything about it showed its age. The cracked crown molding, the warped wood floors that creaked under your weight, the faint smell of mildew that clung to the stairwells. But the rent was cheap, and the unit was big enough for me and all my junk. For a 31-year-old trying to make ends meet as a freelance designer, that was all that mattered. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, directly above Unit 8. I didn't think much about the neighbor downstairs at first. I'd see him occasionally in the lobby, mid-30s maybe, thin frame, glasses always smudged, hair hanging limp like it hadn't been washed in days. He never made eye contact, just shuffled past me with his shoulders hunched, clutching a stack of mail or a grocery bag. Harmless, I thought. Maybe a little socially awkward. Plenty of those in Chicago. The first time I noticed anything strange was one night around 2 in the morning. I was at my desk trying to finish a project when I realized I could hear muffled shouting through the floorboards. At first, I thought he was on the phone, maybe arguing with someone, but the longer I listened, the more wrong it sounded. His voice rose and fell in angry bursts, then dipped into desperate muttering, then exploded again into full-blown screaming. I pressed my ear to the floor, uneasy. There weren't pauses like in a conversation. It was back and forth, but both sides were his voice, one higher, frantic, the other lower, rough, almost inhuman. I told myself maybe he was practicing lines from a play. Maybe he had a podcast. I went back to work and tried to forget about it. But the next night it happened again. And the night after that, by the end of the week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Every night, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, I'd hear him down there arguing with himself. Sometimes the voices overlapped, one shouting while the other whispered back. Other times it was dead silent for a long stretch before the rough voice roared so loud my floor shook. I started wearing headphones to sleep. It didn't help. The vibrations carried through the building itself, rumbling up through the pipes and into the vents. Then came the smell. It crept in slowly like a draft through the floorboards, sulfur, sharp and acidic, sometimes layered with something sweeter like burned hair. Other nights it was the metallic smell of raw meat. I'd open the windows, light candles, burn incense, but nothing covered it completely. One night while I was locking up, I found him in the hallway. He wasn't coming home or leaving. He was just standing there facing the wall, his nose almost touching the peeling wallpaper. His lips moved in frantic whispers, and his hands were flat against the plaster, like he was listening for something on the other side. I froze mid-step. My keys jingled in my hand, and his head twitched, but he didn't turn. His whispering grew faster, more urgent, like he was begging. For what, I didn't know. I slipped past him, heart pounding, and shut myself inside my unit. The next morning I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, he was there, eyes bloodshot, voice raw. He says, "You've been listening." That was all he said. Then he turned and shuffled back into 8, slamming the door. From that point on, everything got worse. Objects in my apartment began shifting overnight. A chair turned slightly away from the table. Silverware scattered across the counter. My keys in a different spot than where I'd left them. I thought maybe I was just distracted, overworked, forgetting things. But then I woke up one morning to find my closet doors wide open. Every piece of clothing pulled from its hangers and piled in the center of the floor. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just me losing track. Someone or something was in my apartment while I slept. The voices grew louder. Some nights I'd lie in bed wide awake and hear them echoing up through the vents. The higher voice pleading, crying. The lower one mocking, taunting, and sometimes layered beneath them both was laughter. Not his, not human. Shadows began to crawl across my walls. At first I thought it was headlights from the street, but they moved wrong. Slow, on purpose, creeping from the floor upward, slithering across the plaster until the corners of my room were soaked in blackness. One night I woke at 2:35 to find him standing in my doorway. At least I thought it was him. The figure was tall and thin, shoulders hunched, hair hanging in his face. He whispered something in a voice that didn't sound like his, then stepped backward into the hall. By the time I scrambled up and flicked on the light, the doorway was empty. I should have called the police, should have packed my things and left. But something in me needed to know. So, a week later, when the screaming downstairs reached a fever pitch, I went down to Unit 8. The door was unlocked. The smell that hit me made my eyes water. Sulfur, rot, copper. I gagged as I stepped inside. Every surface was covered in writing. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, written in soot, scratched into plaster, smeared in what looked like blood. Over and over the same phrase, "I am not the one inside." Furniture was turned over. The windows were blacked out with garbage bags. The air was thick with heat and buzzing with flies. And in the far corner, crouched low to the ground, was my neighbor. He rocked back and forth, arms wrapped around his knees, eyes rolled white. His mouth moved constantly, spilling words in 2 voices at once, one high and frantic, one low and rough, overlapping in a chorus of madness. I whispered his name. His head snapped up. The voices stopped for one heartbeat. Then the lower one rumbled out of his throat in a tone so deep it rattled my bones. "There's room for you too." I stumbled backward, slamming into the doorframe. His body lurched forward, but his limbs bent wrong, too loose, like a puppet yanked by tangled strings. I ran. I didn't stop until I was inside my apartment. Every lock bolted, every window latched. When I called the police the next morning, they came and went quickly. They told me the unit was empty. No furniture, no writing, no tenant, just bare brick walls and dust. The officer gave me a strange look when I insisted I'd seen it. "Unit 8's been vacant for months," he said. But that night, lying in bed, I realized the worst part. For the first time in weeks, it was quiet. No voices through the floor, no shadows crawling the walls until I closed my eyes and heard two voices whispering inside my own head. When I first moved into the little rental house in western Pennsylvania, I thought the best part was how ordinary it seemed. A single-story wood-paneled place at the end of a cul-de-sac. Nothing fancy, nothing historic, just old enough that the floorboards creaked, but not so old that it felt unsafe. For once in my life, I wanted boring. I wanted normal. There was only one neighbor close enough to matter, an older man named Mr. Kessler. He lived in the weather-beaten house right next door, a place that looked as tired as he did. The gutters sagged, the porch paint peeled, and the yard was overgrown with crabgrass. I'd see him sometimes shuffling down his driveway, stooped and pale, muttering under his breath as he hauled his garbage bins to the curb. The first time I met him, I tried to be polite. I waved, said hello, told him I just moved in. He gave me a look so sharp it felt like a warning. Then in a voice low and raspy, he said, "You hear anything at night, don't answer it." That was it. No introduction, no welcome, just that. I laughed it off at the time. Old people said strange things, right? Maybe he was senile, maybe paranoid, but it stuck with me more than I wanted to admit. 2 nights later, I understood why. I woke at exactly 2:58 a.m. to the sound of voices. Dozens of them. They came from outside, or so I thought. I walked barefoot into the kitchen and pressed my ear to the window. The voices rose from the ground, low and layered. Some male, some female, some so young they sounded like children. At first, I thought maybe it was the TV next door. But when I stepped outside onto the porch, I realized the sound wasn't coming from Kessler's house itself. It was coming from beneath it. His basement windows, low to the ground, square panes crusted with dirt, were glowing faint red. I stood frozen on my porch, listening as the voices grew louder, overlapping until it sounded like a choir of the damned. And then cutting through the noise, I heard my own name, whispered, drawn out. I stumbled back inside and locked the door. The next morning, I saw Kessler sitting on his porch. His skin looked grayer in the daylight, his eyes sunk deep. I wanted to pretend nothing had happened, but the words spilled out before I could stop myself. "What's in your basement?" I asked. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "They're not mine anymore." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a hiss. "If you hear them calling, don't go down there. They'll sound like people, you know. That's how they get you." Then he stood and went inside. I didn't sleep well for the rest of the week. Every night, like clockwork, the voices rose again. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they cried, sometimes they begged, clawing at my mind with words that weren't quite clear, until they were. By the 5th night, I heard my mother's voice. She'd been dead for years, but it was her calling my name, pleading for help. Her tone breaking with the exact same sobs I'd heard when she was alive. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands shaking, and almost opened my door. Almost. But Kessler's warning rang in my ears, and I stayed put. The nights grew worse. I noticed that Kessler's house was changing. By day, it looked more and more abandoned. The blinds sagged, the paint flaked, the mailbox overflowed. But at night, the glow came back, pulsing faintly through those basement windows like a heartbeat. One night I counted the windows. 4 across the front, square and dirty. The next night there were 6, then 8. By the end of the month, there were rows of them stretching across the foundation, like the house itself was sprouting new levels underground. I told myself I was imagining it, that stress and lack of sleep were twisting my thinking. But deep down I knew something was wrong. It came to a head one stormy night in November. The rain pounded, thunder shook the glass, and at exactly 3:00 a.m., the voices surged louder than ever. I pressed my pillow to my ears, but it didn't help. They weren't muffled anymore. They were inside the walls. My light fixture rattled overhead. My floorboards trembled. The voices bled up through the pipes until I swore they were rising out of my own drains. And in the middle of the noise, a low groan rolled under it all. Deep, hungry, like the sound of an empty stomach amplified to inhuman levels. I snapped. I grabbed a flashlight and stormed into the rain, water soaking through my clothes in seconds. I told myself I was just going to look, just going to prove to myself that it was all in my head. But when I reached Kessler's yard, I saw him. He was standing at the top of the basement steps, his frail frame lit by the glow, his lips moved in frantic whispers. And though the storm drowned most of it out, I caught a few words. Stay down, stay down. He's hungry tonight. He didn't look at me, didn't even flinch as I edged closer. His eyes were locked on the black void below. The smell hit me next. Rot, sulfur, rusted metal. It burned my throat and watered my eyes. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity, stubbornness, some mix of both. But I stepped past him and shined my light down the stairs. What I saw wasn't a basement. It was a cavern. The stairs stretched far beyond the limits of the house, spiraling downward into blackness. The walls were lined with door frames, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one standing crooked and ajar. Beyond them was nothing. No rooms, no hallways, just endless black voids. And from each doorway, hands reached out, pale, thin, clawing, faces pressed against the darkness, mouths gaping as voices screamed my name. Some were strangers, others I recognized. My childhood best friend, an ex-girlfriend, my dead mother, even myself. My own face, lips moving in sync with the voices, begging for help. I staggered backward, but the stairs pulled at me like gravity had shifted. My light flickered, and for a split second I saw something at the bottom. Kessler, or what was left of him. His body hung suspended, chest cavity ripped open. Dozens of mouths gaped where his organs should have been, screaming in unison, their tongues writhing like worms. His eyes rolled blindly in different directions as his jaw unhinged far wider than it should. I stumbled, slipped, scrambled back up the steps, my flashlight clattering against the concrete. By the time I reached the top, Kessler was gone. The storm roared. The glow faded. When I looked back the next morning, the basement door wasn't there anymore. Just solid siding where it had been. No steps, no windows, no sign there had ever been an entrance at all. I tried to convince myself it was a dream. That tiredness had warped my senses. But then 2 nights later I woke to a new sound. Scratching. Not from outside, not from under the floor. From my own living room wall, I crept out of bed, heart hammering, and flicked on the light. There it was, a door. A basement door that hadn't been there before, built seamlessly into the drywall. Its edges glowed faint red. The scratching grew louder. I forced myself closer, legs shaking, ears straining against the wood.
And that's when I heard it.
My mother's voice, soft, gentle, whispering my name.